On the cold morning of the 6th of November, 1730, in the courtyard of a fortress on the Prussian frontier, an 18-year-old boy was held at a barred window and made to watch a man walk to his death. The boy was the Crown Prince of Prussia, heir to one of the hardest thrones in Europe. The man crossing the yard below was a young officer of the guard named Hermann von Katte, and he was the person the prince loved best in the world. They had tried to run away together, out of a kingdom that one of them could no longer bear, toward a freedom that neither of them would ever reach. They had been caught. And the boy's own father, the king, had arranged the scene with terrible care, that the son should stand at the window while the friend knelt below it, so that the prince might learn, once and for all, what disobedience cost. He called down once, in French, begging forgiveness. The answer came back that there was nothing to forgive. Then the stroke fell, and the boy at the window collapsed into the arms of the men set to hold him there. The child who fainted at that window would grow into the most celebrated monarch of his century. The world would come to know him as Frederick the Great, the soldier Napoleon studied and feared, the philosopher who played the flute and traded letters with Voltaire, the master of a small and unpromising kingdom that he dragged by sheer force of will into the front rank of nations. History remembers him in two flattering shapes: the invincible warrior, the serene sage of Sanssouci. Both of them are masks. This is the story of the boy behind them. The kingdom into which he was born was scarcely a kingdom at all. For centuries the House of Hohenzollern had ruled a scattering of poor and disconnected lands strewn across the sandy plains of northern Germany, the electorate of Brandenburg around Berlin, the remote duchy of Prussia far off on the Baltic, a handful of enclaves out along the Rhine. Territories with no natural frontiers, no great wealth, and no obvious reason to hold together, wedged among the powers of Europe like a plank laid between millstones. Only in 1701, 11 years before his birth, had the head of the family at last been permitted to call himself a king, and then merely a king in Prussia, as though the very title were held on sufferance. What such a state possessed, and what it would come to be built around, to the near exclusion of everything else, was an army. More than any other country in Europe, it was a place that existed to make soldiers. Into this hard and unfinished kingdom, on the 24th of January, 1712, in the royal palace at Berlin, a son was born to the Crown Prince and his wife, and christened Frederick. He was not their first child, but the two boys born before him had died in the cradle, and so from his first breath he carried upon him the whole weight of the dynasty's survival. A living male heir was, in that family, a kind of political miracle, and the guns of the Berlin arsenal were fired across the winter city to announce him. The child would be raised as the future of a state that measured its worth in regiments, and raised above all by the man who had made it so. That man was his father, and there has seldom sat upon a European throne a stranger or more forbidding figure. In 1713, when Frederick was scarcely a year old, the crown passed to Frederick William I, the king that history would remember as the soldier king. He was frugal to the very edge of miserliness, wearing a plain blue uniform coat until it frayed, and counting the coins of his treasury like a merchant in fear of ruin. He was subject to violent, unpredictable rages, and would lay about him with a heavy cane at courtiers and servants, and in the fullness of time at his own children. He was gloomily and rigidly pious, a Calvinist who believed that God had appointed him to drill his kingdom into order, and he was possessed by a single consuming passion which was his army, And within that army, by one peculiar obsession, a regiment of extraordinarily tall soldiers, the grenadiers whom a mocking Europe called the Potsdam giants, and whom he gathered from every corner of the continent, bought, bargained for, and on occasion simply had kidnapped, as another prince might collect paintings or fine porcelain. He ran his palace exactly as he ran his parade ground. Even his hours of ease took the shape of the Tabakskollegium, the smoke-filled evening tobacco college, where ministers and generals sat in their shirt-sleeves over beer and coarse jokes, and the business of a kingdom was settled in a fog of cheap Dutch tobacco. He had, moreover, a precise and pitiless idea of the son he meant to make. Frederick William I set down instructions for the boy's upbringing in his own hand, dividing his days into an unbroken schedule of prayer, economy, and the arts of war, with no hour left idle and no place at all for what the king dismissed as French frivolity. His heir was to be raised a soldier and a careful manager of money, hardened, God-fearing, and plain. Latin was forbidden as useless. By one much-repeated story, the king burst in upon a tutor teaching the boy his declensions and fell on the man with his cane, though the tale, like much of what we know of that household, comes down to us softened or sharpened by the retelling, and must be held a little at arm's length. Against all this granite stood the boy's mother, and she could hardly have been more his father's opposite. Sophia Dorothea of Hanover was the daughter of the Elector of Hanover, who would become, in 1714, King George I of Great Britain, and she was the sister of the future George II. She was proud, cultivated, and ambitious, and she carried into the grey Prussian court the tastes and pretensions of a great dynasty on the rise. She dreamed of binding her children to the royal house of Britain, of a double marriage that would see her son wed an English princess and her daughter an English prince, and she filled the boy's imagination with the glitter of a wider and gentler world than his father's barracks. The household in which Frederick grew was therefore a house divided at its very foundation between the plain-coated king who worshipped discipline and the queen who dreamed of England, and the watchful child between them learned early how to live between two fires, for sensitive he unmistakably was. From his earliest years Frederick showed himself quick, clever, and drawn to precisely those things his father most despised, to music above all, and to the transverse flute, which he studied in secret under the finest teacher he could smuggle to his rooms, to French, which he came to speak, and to write more readily than his own German, to poetry, to philosophy, and to the elegant mocking wit of the French Enlightenment. When he played, servants were posted to watch for the king's approach, and the flute and the music and the fashionable dressing gown were made to vanish at a word. His closest ally in all of this was his elder sister Wilhelmina, the one soul in the palace who shared both his tastes and his terrors, and whose memoirs, written long afterward and darkened by a lifetime's accumulated resentment, so that the historian must lean upon them and distrust them in the same breath, remain our most vivid window onto that unhappy childhood. His tutors, too, quietly conspired in his education against the king's express command. One of them, a French refugee named Duhan de Jandun, fed the boy's hunger for books and helped him gather a secret library of some thousands of volumes hidden away in Berlin, a whole clandestine world of the mind kept carefully out of his father's sight. Because his father's sight, when it fell upon such things, was terrible. Frederick William I looked at his gifted son and saw not a prince but a weakling, an effeminate, French-addled, flute-playing coward who would one day let the great machine of the Prussian state rattle itself to pieces, and he set himself to beat the softness out of the boy with a thoroughness that curdled across the years. into something close to persecution. He struck him at the dinner table and on the parade square, before servants and before foreign envoys. He mocked and humiliated him in public. He tore the flute and the French books from his hands. By Wilhelmine's account, there were scenes of genuine violence, the king seizing the prince by the hair and dragging him across a room, striking him to the floor, on one dreadful occasion catching at his throat. And while a sister's pen may well have sharpened the memory, the essential fact is beyond dispute, confirmed in the king's own letters and in the reports of those who looked on. The soldier king made his heir's boyhood a place of fear. What such treatment could never do was alter the boy's nature. What it did instead was teach him to conceal it. He learned to hide the flute and the forbidden books, to wear obedience like a mask drawn tight over contempt, to give his father a docile and untroubled face while his true self stayed locked somewhere the blows could not follow. It was a schooling in dissimulation he would never afterward unlearn, and that would one day make him unreadable to every court in Europe. But a mask is not a piece, and by the summer of 1730, the strain of wearing it had grown past all bearing. The prince was 18 now. The longed-for English marriage had collapsed in a wreck of diplomacy and mistrust, carrying with it his last dream of escape into his mother's brighter world. The beatings had not stopped, and the years ahead stretched out before him as an endless servitude beneath a father who despised the whole of what he was. And so Frederick made the most dangerous decision of his young life. He resolved to run. By his 18th year, the crown prince had learned to lie in order to live, to hide his books and his flute, to smile at the table where he was struck, to wear his father's blue uniform like a hair shirt drawn over a Frenchman's heart. But a boy can be bent only so far before he breaks or runs, and Frederick had resolved to run. He would slip across the frontier to the England of his mother's people, and he would take with him the one person in the world he wholly trusted, a young officer of the guard named Hermann von Katte. Neither of them yet understood that in the kingdom of the soldier king, the price of a prince's flight would be paid in another man's blood. The flight had been the dream of a whole desperate summer, and in the end it was betrayed almost before it began. In the summer of 1730, Frederick William I set out on a long progress through the southern territories of the Holy Roman Empire, and he commanded his son to ride with him, so that the crown prince travelled as a kind of prisoner in his father's own train, watched at every posting-house, corrected at every table, an unhappy young man of 18 from whom the king had stripped his books, his flute, and very nearly his sense of himself. The great dream of an English marriage had already collapsed in a wreck of diplomacy, and with it the last respectable road out of his misery. His mother's long-cherished scheme of a double match that would have wed him to an English princess, and his sister Wilhelmina to the Prince of Wales, was dead. The beatings had not stopped, and so it was on that slow journey through the towns of southern Germany that Frederick resolved to take the most dangerous road left to him. He would slip across the frontier and make for the England of his mother's people, the court of his uncle King George II, where he still let himself believe that a gentler life might be waiting. He would not go alone. Into the plan he drew a second young officer, a Lieutenant Keith, and above all, the one person in the world he wholly trusted, the officer of the guard, Hermann von Katte. The scheme was as reckless as the misery that drove it. A horse, quietly readied, a disguise assumed, a border to be crossed before the king could learn that his heir had gone. But Frederick William I governed his household as he governed his regiments, by informers and unsleeping vigilance, and the plot was discovered before it could be carried through. When the king grasped what his son had attempted, he answered not with a father's grief but with the fury of a commander who has uncovered a mutiny in his own ranks. By the account of Wilhelmina, the prince's sister, a witness vivid beyond price, though she set down her memories long afterward and with a lifetime's bitterness behind them, so that the historian must lean upon her and distrust her in the same breath. The king's rage came very near to murder, and he had to be physically held back from running his own son through where he stood. Lieutenant Keith, warned in time, spurred across the border and vanished into a long exile abroad. Katte, slower or less fortunate, was taken, and Frederick was placed under close arrest, his papers seized, the letters and confidences of the escape spread out as evidence against him. For the prince, the reckoning was designed to strip away every vestige of his rank. He was not, to his father's mind, a boy who had quarrelled with his family. He was a commissioned officer of the Prussian army who had attempted the capital crime of desertion, and he was handled precisely as one. Desertion, in the Prussia the soldier king had built, stood among the blackest of all crimes, and for an officer to abandon his post and flee the country was a thing the army answered with death. Stripped of his sword and his commission, Frederick was carried to the fortress of Küstrin on the Oder to the east of Berlin and shut up there while the king set about turning the whole affair into a lesson that neither his heir nor his court would ever forget. For a time it was uncertain how far that lesson would be carried, for by the letter of the same law the prince's own life was forfeit. A court-martial of senior officers was convened to try the conspirators, but the judges balked at the enormity of what was demanded of them. To send the heir to the throne and his companion to the scaffold was more than their consciences or their instinct for self-preservation could bear, and for Katte they returned a sentence not of death but of imprisonment, calling his share in the escape the folly of a young man rather than the design of a traitor. Frederick William I would not be denied. From his cabinet the absolute king struck out the judgment of his own tribunal and set his own in its place. Katte, he commanded, was to die, beheaded as a deserter, and beheaded where the prince he had tried to help could be made to watch. Into the sentence went a single, sombre concession. In recognition of the long and honourable service of the Katte family to the house of Hohenzollern, the young officer was to be spared the more degrading ends kept for common deserters, the rope, the wheel, and granted instead the cleaner stroke of the sword. That was the whole of the mercy in it. The rest was conceived as a weapon aimed at the mind of the king's own son, for Frederick William I meant not merely to punish a treason, but to reach into his heir and tear out the single attachment that had given the boy the strength to stand against him. To grasp why a king would kill a gifted young officer to school his own son, one must understand the man who had built the Prussian state. Frederick William I believed with the whole hard force of his Calvinist certainty that a throne was a post of duty and a kingdom a garrison, and that the first of all virtues in a subject, in a soldier, in a son, was obedience without question and without limit. His heir's flight was to him no boy's unhappiness, but a soldier's desertion and a subject's treason, a crack in the very foundation of the order he had spent his life laying. Katte's death was meant to teach the son, in the plainest language the king possessed, that in this kingdom disobedience was paid for in full. What the bond between the prince and Katte truly was has been argued over ever since, and it cannot now be settled. That the two were exceptionally close is beyond dispute. One figure of the court observed that they bore themselves toward one another with an intimacy more like that of a lover and his mistress than of two young soldiers, and reports of that colour clung to Frederick for the rest of his days, as did the broader question of his sexuality, which historians debate to this day. Here, the evidence is wholly circumstantial. No physical relationship is proven. The fixed categories of a later age sit poorly upon the intense, theatrical, half-literary friendships of the 18th century. And serious scholars divide and are honest enough to own the doubt. What is certain, and is enough, is that in a world which had offered him nothing but fear, Katte was the one human being Frederick trusted without reserve, and that it was exactly this bond his father had resolved to sever. For the better part of 3 months, the prince had been held at Küstrin, uncertain of his own fate and of his friends', while the sentence was contested over his head and then fixed. The morning of the 6th of November, 1730, broke cold and grey over the fortress. Every particular of what was to come had been arranged by the king with a meticulous and terrible care. Katte was to be led across the courtyard directly beneath the window of the room in which Frederick was confined, so that the prince could not fail to see. And in a final refinement, the 2 young men were dressed alike, as though to hold the condemned officer up as a mirror to the prince, who was to be left living. Frederick was brought to the window and made to stand there. Below, in the raw light of the yard, his friend was led out to die. What passed between them then comes down to us only as it was afterward reported, near contemporary, much retold, and it is right to hold it as report and not as transcript. Frederick, it was said, called down to Katte in French, the private language of everything the two had shared, and begged forgiveness for the ruin he had brought upon him. The reply that came back by those same accounts was steady and without reproach, that there was nothing to forgive, and that Katte went to his death content. Then the order was given. The stroke fell once, and it was over, and the 18-year-old at the window sank down insensible into the arms of the men set to hold him there. When he came to himself, the friend he had begged for forgiveness was a shape under a black cloth in the grey November yard, and something in Frederick had been cut away by the same blade. He would live another 56 years. Never again, so far as any human being could afterward tell, would he let himself love another person without reserve or reservation. His father had meant to break his son into obedience. He had broken something far deeper than that, and it would never mend. The months that followed the execution of Hermann von Katte were a slow, grinding crucible. Stripped of his rank, his sword, and his liberty, the crown prince remained a prisoner at the fortress of Küstrin, and there his father set about the second half of his design. It was not enough that the sun had been made to watch, now the sun was to be remade. Frederick was forbidden the capital and the court, forbidden even the blue uniform he had once worn, and set to work as the most junior of officials in the local War and Domains chamber, the Kriegs- und Domänenkammer, the provincial engine through which the Prussian crown gathered its taxes, managed its royal estates, and fed and recruited its army. Day after day, the boy who had dreamed of music and French verse was made to sit among the clerks and tally grain yields and wool prices, to audit the accounts of the royal domains, to master the excise and the workings of the recruiting cantons. It was conceived as a humiliation, a means of grinding the prince's face into the mundane machinery of the state he would one day inherit. It became, quite by accident, the most valuable education of his life. In the dusty offices of Küstrin, Frederick learned how a poor state was squeezed for its last copper. He learned how its revenues were raised and its estates worked, how the peasantry lived and the tax-gatherer functioned, how the whole labyrinthine apparatus of Prussian administration could be turned to the single purpose of power. And he learned at the same time a colder and more personal lesson. He wrote to his father long letters of submission, laced with the careful, hollow language of penitence. acknowledging his faults, praising the king's wisdom, swearing himself to the service of the crown. It was a performance of such exquisite and chilling precision that it convinced even the king, who began to believe that the iron had at last entered his son's soul. But the crown prince was only practicing the essential art of his youth, that if you give a tyrant exactly what he demands, in every form that does not touch what you truly are, he will in time leave you alone. The reconciliation, when it came, was slow and closely watched, and it was granted only on the king's own terms. Frederick was required to abase himself utterly, to swear an oath of obedience, and to accept without a murmur whatever future his father chose to lay out for him. Informers reported on his conduct, his letters were read, his every relapse into the old frivolity was noted and weighed. He gave the king the total submission that was demanded, and he gave it so convincingly that the watchers were satisfied. And in the giving, the mask that he had first learned to wear as a frightened child hardened into a second skin he would never again put off. Obedience became a performance so practiced that it ceased, at last, to look like performance at all. The restoration of his liberty came by slow and calculated stages. First, he was released from the fortress into the town, permitted to lodge and to move about under watch. Then, as his father's suspicion cooled, he was allowed once more the uniform that had been stripped from him. And at length he was given a command of his own, the colonelcy of an infantry regiment garrisoned at the little town of Neuruppin. By the time he was suffered to return to the court, the transformation seemed, on its surface, complete. The young man who emerged from Küstrin had learned to be a chameleon. He could talk of musket drill and crop rotations and the logistics of a march with all the earnest gravity his father required. And then, in the evenings, when the king was lost in his tobacco and his generals, he would withdraw into his own rooms and quietly resume the life he had learned to hide. He had become a master of the double existence, a creature who walked the world in the grey uniform of dutiful obedience while his inner self stayed locked away, a private fortress of French philosophy and skepticism, and lonely, unspoken rebellion. The last tether was knotted in 1733. The king, resolved to bind his son to a future of his own choosing, had settled a betrothal the year before and now pressed the marriage upon him, and Frederick, who had learned at Küstrin the price of refusal, obeyed. The bride was Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Bevan, a young woman of good birth and quiet, unassuming piety, and of little else to recommend her to a prince whose imagination lived in the salons of Paris and the pages of Voltaire. Frederick's own letters from those months, written to his sister and his confidants, are stripped of all pretence. He regarded the match with a cold and settled distaste, spoke of the princess with a polite but absolute indifference, and made no secret that he saw in the union nothing but a transaction of state. He submitted to it as he submitted to everything his father demanded, outwardly entire, inwardly untouched. The tragedy of Elizabeth Christine was that she was a gentle and loyal woman bound to a man who had long since decided he had no room left in him for another person. In the first years he was superficially attentive, playing the dutiful husband, but the marriage produced no children, and the moment Frederick came into his own, the distance became permanent and absolute. On his accession he would install her at the Palace of Schönhausen, outside Berlin, and there she lived out a long life of solitary and dignified retirement, a queen who was almost never in the king's presence, a figure to be treated with formal glacial respect and never as a companion. She was the first casualty of the thing Küstrin had made of him. He had come out of that fortress having learned that those you allow yourself to love are taken from you, and that the only safe way to live is to keep the whole world at the length of an outstretched arm. He turned instead to his greyhounds, to his flute, and to the silent company of his books. As the 1730s wore on, the long war between father and son settled into a wary, exhausted truce. The king was failing now, his great body ravaged by gout and dropsy, and the ceaseless labour of his own iron discipline, and he watched with a grim, hard-won satisfaction as his heir came at last to resemble the prince he had wanted. Frederick was a colonel who knew the manual of arms as well as any veteran. He could speak of the weight of a musket and the ordering of a march with an authority that surprised the old king's circle in the smoke-filled evenings of the Tobacco College. The two men had fought each other for the better part of 30 years, and in these last seasons they arrived at something that was not affection but was no longer open war. Frederick had become the soldier prince his father had set out to forge, efficient, exact, and outwardly cold, and the soldier king, sensing his own end drawing near, began to speak of his son with a guarded and grudging pride. But the man that pride approved of was only the surface. Beneath it lived a creature of a permanently divided mind, at war with himself in a way his father would never comprehend. He was a philosopher schooled against his will in the cold arithmetic of the bayonet, a lover of music and beauty, taught to see the world over the top of a barracks wall, a believer in the enlightenment of the mind, harnessed to the service of a state that existed for nothing but the security and the enlargement of its own borders. He had made himself the most capable instrument of his father's will, and in the making he had hollowed out a vast and permanent loneliness. He had learned to observe the world without ever quite touching it, to reckon the cost of everything without ever letting himself feel its worth. He was, in the deepest sense, a man waiting for a curtain to fall, for a reign to end, for the single thing that would set him free. He had given his father everything that was demanded of him, the submission, the uniform, the loveless wife he would keep at arm's length for half a century, and in return he had been handed back his freedom, his regiment, and a future. But the young man who came out of Küstrin was not the boy who had gone in. He had learned to wear obedience like armor, and to keep his true self locked in a place no one could reach. Now he needed only one thing more, and nature was preparing to grant it. In the spring of 1740 the soldier king lay dying, and the throne of Prussia, with its full treasury and its magnificent untested army, was about to pass to the son he had spent 30 years trying to break. The years that followed his release from the shadow of Küstrin were governed by a measured and meticulous dissimulation. Frederick had taken the lesson of the window entirely into himself, that his father's will was absolute, that obedience was the only coin the crown prince was permitted to spend, and that survival lay in becoming wholly unreadable. He accepted the wife his father had pressed upon him, and kept her, ever after, at a courteous and unbridgeable distance. He performed the duties of a subaltern officer and a trainee administrator with a mechanical exactness that masked the detachment beneath. And then, in 1736, the king's temper eased enough to let his heir withdraw from the suffocating nearness of the Berlin court. Frederick was given the small, moated castle of Rheinsberg, set among woods and water to the north of the capital, and there, for the first and very nearly the only time in his life, he built the world he had always been denied. The 4 years at Rheinsberg were, by every account he ever gave of them, the happiest of his life. He gathered about him a small and carefully chosen court, musicians, a few congenial soldiers, men of wit and learning, and held the grey reality of his father's Prussia at bay behind a screen of music and books and talk. There were concerts nearly every evening, the prince himself taking up the flute he had once had to hide. There was French poetry and philosophy, and the elegant, mocking conversation of the Enlightenment that the soldier king had despised as so much foreign frippery. The days had their own gentle order, reading and letters in the mornings, study or the chase in the afternoons, music when the light began to fail, a rhythm as unlike his father's barracks as anything on earth could be. Here Frederick read and wrote and composed. Here he assembled, quietly, the circle of companions who would populate his reign. Here he tasted, for 4 unrepeatable years, a sovereignty of the spirit that did not demand the crushing of the soul. It was the one long interlude of ease the man would ever know, and he seems to have understood, even at the time, that it could not last. It was from this retreat that he reached out in 1736 to the most celebrated mind in Europe. The crown prince of a hard and second-rate kingdom sat down to write to Voltaire. The most famous writer of the age, the very embodiment, to Frederick, of reason turned against the cruelty and ignorance of the world. And Voltaire, never proof against the flattery of a royal disciple, wrote back. So began one of the great correspondences of the century, a friendship conducted almost wholly on paper that would run through admiration and disillusion and one savage rupture until Voltaire's death more than 40 years later, in 1778. From the first, the letters were performances on both sides, 2 clever men measuring one another, each holding up to the other a flattering mirror of his own vanity. Yet the hunger in them was real. The prince wrote not as a future commander of armies, but as a man of letters who dreamed of a throne ruled by reason and justice and the humane pursuit of knowledge, and cast himself as the pupil, the enlightened hope of a continent still half in chains to its past. For the prince, the exchange was a lifeline flung toward the wider world he had been denied. For the writer, it was the intoxicating prospect of a throne that might one day be governed by philosophy itself. It was in these last Regensburg years, too, that Frederick set himself to fix his own political creed in writing. He took up the most cynical handbook of power ever composed, Machiavelli's The Prince, and set out to refute it, chapter by chapter. The result, written across 1739 and 1740, was the Anti-Machiavel, a treatise that read as the public manifesto of the kind of king he meant to be. In its pages, the young prince argued with a fervent and carefully reasoned idealism that the sovereign was not the owner of the state, but its first servant, that his single duty was the welfare, the security, and the liberty of his people, and that the ruler who spilled his subjects' blood to seize his neighbour's lands for the sake of glory was no hero, but a criminal against mankind. He preached toleration, the rule of law, the keeping of faith, and the necessity of peace. He sent the manuscript to Voltaire to be polished and seen through the press, and the book appeared, published in the Netherlands, in 1740, even as its author stood upon the threshold of contradicting every line of it. That the most celebrated pen in Europe had helped to launch a young prince's case against conquest only sharpened the irony of what was to follow. In his own mind, he was the very antithesis of the tyrant. Whether that creed was the true face of the man or the pose of a gifted prince who had not yet been tested, no one could then say with certainty, and perhaps Frederick himself could not have said. Both readings have their evidence, and both would find their proof soon enough, for the man would answer the question himself with his armies. What can be said is that the ideals were set down with real eloquence and real thought by a prince who had every reason, after Küstrin, to loathe the naked exercise of power, and that this same prince had been raised inside the most efficient war machine in Europe by a father who measured all human worth in steel and knew that machine when the moment should come better than any man alive. The world beyond Regensburg, meanwhile, went its own way. the soldier king was failing, his great body broken at last by gout and dropsy, and the relentless discipline he had imposed upon himself no less than upon his kingdom. When Frederick William I died on the 31st of May 1740, he left behind him a state that was a masterpiece of cold and functional power. He had filled the treasury with the savings of a miserly reign. He had built a bureaucracy that ran with the regularity of a clock. And he had drilled an army that was the envy and the terror of Europe, the best trained instrument of war on the continent, raised by a poor kingdom to a strength far beyond its size. All of it, the treasure, the machine, the army, he bequeathed to the son he had spent a lifetime trying to break. Frederick, 28 years old, stepped into his father's place, and a ripple of expectation ran through the courts of Europe. The poets and philosophers who had followed his correspondence with Voltaire looked for a new kind of monarch, a philosopher king who would let the barracks stand idle, patronize the arts, and beat the sword into a ploughshare. And in those first months the new king seemed to answer to the hope. He moved with a cultivated, effortless grace. He spoke and wrote his French like a native. He gathered the men of learning he had long admired and wore the manner of the enlightened prince he had described in his book. He appeared, in everything, to be the opposite of his father. Yet beneath the poet-king stood the man his father's house had forged. He knew, as no philosophe in Paris could know, that in the exposed and frontierless kingdom he had inherited, power was not a moral abstraction, but the plain condition of survival. He knew the machine his father had built better than any living soul, and he knew exactly what it could do. He had been trained from boyhood to read the map of Europe for its weaknesses, and so the contradiction stood complete, though few outside could yet see it. He had written a book that was a monument of Enlightenment morality, denouncing the very aggression that had made his dynasty. He had declared that a ruler's only office was to guard his people, and that to wage war for fame was a crime against humanity. And he sat now at the head of a state that had no natural defences and lived by its army alone, with a full treasury at his hand and the finest soldiers in Europe polished and idle and waiting for a command. In the very season that his book against tyrants came off the presses, corrected and championed by Voltaire himself, Frederick buried his father and took up the crown. Europe believed it knew the king it was getting, a flute-playing philosophe who wrote French verse and quoted the ancients, who had declared in print that the prince who seizes his neighbour's land is a criminal against mankind. It was about to be corrected, for in December of that same year, with the ink scarcely dry on his treatise against Machiavelli, the philosopher king would march an army across a snowbound frontier to take a rich province that was not his. And the age of Frederick the Great would begin with an act of naked theft. He had taken the crown speaking the language of the philosopher he had been at Rheinsberg. The Prussia he meant to build, he let it be known in those first months, would be a kingdom of law, he promised, a state where the sovereign existed to serve the people, and where the pen would always be mightier than the sword. It was the rhetoric of a prince who had passed his youth in the quiet libraries of Rheinsberg, dreaming of a world ordered by reason and justice, and it was uttered with a clarity that persuaded much of Europe that a new age of enlightenment had dawned in the north. But beneath the philosophical polish there remained the son of the soldier king, and the inheritance of a state whose only fluent language was the movement of battalions. And then, in October of 1740, the news came from Vienna that would put the philosopher to the proof. The Emperor Charles VI was dead and had left the whole vast inheritance of the Habsburgs to his daughter, Maria Theresa, a young woman of 23, whose right to it rested upon the pragmatic sanction a legal instrument that half the powers of Europe had solemnly guaranteed, and that as many were now preparing to ignore. To the chancelleries of Paris and Munich and Madrid, the death of the emperor was an open invitation to fall upon the Habsburg lands and strip them while the heiress was young and untried. To Frederick, 5 months a king, it was something more precise, a single, unrepeatable opening through which a second-rate kingdom might be dragged into the front rank of nations. He did not hesitate. The man who had denounced the cynical machinations of conquerors in the Anti-Machiavel spent the closing weeks of 1740 setting in motion the very army his father had spent a lifetime honing into a lethal and obedient tool. The Hohenzollerns held certain ancient and much disputed claims to a handful of Silesian duchies, and it was upon these, furbished up for the occasion, that Frederick rested his case. But no one in Europe, and least of all the king himself, mistook the parchment for the motive. On the 16th of December, without a declaration of war, without an ultimatum, he crossed the frontier into Silesia, a rich and populous Austrian province, dense with linen and iron and coal, that lay against the flank of his kingdom like a wedge of gold. He had written, in the very book Voltaire was then seeing through the press, that the prince who seizes a neighbour's land is a bandit in the eyes of the world. Now, at the head of some 27,000 men, he marched to make himself exactly that. The stroke was as sudden as it was brazen. Within weeks the Prussians had overrun almost the whole of the province, for Austria, taken entirely by surprise in the dead of winter, had scarcely a garrison in the field to stop them. He never pretended in later years that it had been anything else. In his own writings he was startlingly candid about the springs of the act, the hunger for fame, the wish to see his name in the gazettes of Europe, the cold conviction that a state which does not grow is a state that has already begun to die. The philosopher of Rheinsberg had not been killed by the King of Prussia. He had simply been set aside the instant the interest of the state required it. He had written against tyranny and marched out to practice it. And this contradiction is the hinge upon which the whole man turned. In the same season that his treatise against the cynical conqueror came from the press, corrected and praised by the most famous writer alive, its author committed in cold blood, and in his very first year upon the throne, the precise crime the book had condemned. Both things were true. Both were Frederick. No account of him that keeps only one of them is worth the telling. The war itself proved far bloodier and more chaotic than the ordered evolutions Frederick had drilled on the sandy squares of Potsdam. On the 10th of April, 1741, at the village of Mollwitz, the Prussian army met the Austrians in a wild, swirling clash that left the young king's reputation hanging by a thread. His cavalry, untried and caught in the shock of an Austrian charge, was broken and swept from the field, and Frederick himself, carried along in the rout and convinced that the day was lost beyond recall, let his senior general, the veteran Field Marshal Schwerin, persuade him to ride from the battle to preserve his own person. It was the first, and perhaps the most searing, humiliation of his military life. For while the king galloped away in the belief that his crown was unravelling, his infantry did not break. Drilled to a machine-like discipline, they closed their ranks and held, loading and firing faster than any troops in Europe, until the Austrian tide broke upon them and rolled back. By the time word reached Frederick, the battle had been won without him. It was a victory, but it was a victory that shamed him, and the memory of his flight from Mollwitz would drive him for the rest of his life toward an obsessive and unforgiving pursuit of military mastery. In the years that followed, he would rebuild the arm that had failed him, drilling his cavalry until it was no longer the weak point of Mollwitz, but a striking force the equal of his famous foot. The war Frederick had opened did not stay penned within Silesia. It kindled a wider blaze in the War of the Austrian Succession, as France and Bavaria and Spain closed in upon the young queen like wolves upon a wounded stag. But Maria Theresa, whom he had gambled on finding weak, proved to be nothing of the kind. She rallied her scattered dominions, threw herself upon the loyalty of her Hungarian nobles, and fought for her inheritance with a tenacity that startled the courts that had written her off. And though she could not in the end hold Silesia, she never for 1 hour accepted its loss. Through the chaos he had helped to loose, Frederick moved with a cold and shifting agility, bound by no loyalty that outlived his advantage. He made treaties and broke them when the wind changed. He came to terms with Vienna and then returned to the war when it suited him. He manoeuvred his army with a dexterity that left allies and enemies alike bewildered and mistrustful. The philosopher had become, in the mouths of the courts of Europe, a byword for cold faithlessness, the enlightened king who played the game of power with a ruthlessness that would have made Machiavelli himself pause. The fighting fell into 2 hard wars for the single prize. The first Frederick closed in 1742 at the Treaty of Breslau, which left Silesia in his hands after the bloody field of Chotusitz. But the peace was a pause and not a settlement, and within 2 years he was at war again to keep what he had taken. In 1745 he proved at Hohenfriedberg that he had learned the lessons his early failures had taught him, winning a victory as clean and complete as Mollwitz had been ragged. And by the Treaty of Dresden, signed at the close of that year, Silesia was confirmed firmly and undeniably as Prussian. The middling kingdom of the Hohenzollerns was gone. In its place stood a great power that had cut its standing into the map of Europe with the edge of a sword, and a king whom his people, and soon the wider world, had begun to call the Great, a title he wore with the same mixture of pride and cynical detachment that marked his every act. The anti-Machiavel remained in print through it all, a standing testament to the man he had once meant to be, even as the king he had become ruled a state that lived by conquest. The prize had not been cheap. The fields of Chotusitz and Hohenfriedberg had been bought with thousands of lives on either side, an early installment of a price Prussia would go on paying for a generation. He had taken Silesia, and he would keep it, and the theft made Prussia a great power, and its king a name spoken in every chancellery in Europe. But it also made him an enemy who would never forgive and never rest. Maria Theresa, the young queen he had robbed in her first year on the throne, who would spend the next 2 decades assembling the coalition to destroy him. And it taught the continent the truth about the philosopher of Rheinsberg, that the man who wrote so beautifully against conquest would seize whatever his army could hold. The books and the flute were real. So was the theft. Both of them were Frederick, and Europe would spend a generation learning to dread the second. To understand the man, it is necessary first to understand the instrument, because everything else in the story of Frederick, the conquests and the reversals, the survival against odds that ought to have destroyed him, rested upon a single foundation, and that foundation was the Prussian army. It was the one thing the poor and scattered Hohenzollern lands had ever possessed in real abundance. His father, the soldier king, had drilled and hoarded and all but worshipped it. The son had taken the machine his father built and refined it into something more formidable still. And it was, in its cold and tireless precision, the nearest thing to a self-portrait that Frederick ever made, the most disciplined fighting force in Europe, and the clearest picture of the mind that wielded it. So completely did this small kingdom bend itself to the upkeep of that force that a celebrated epigram, usually credited to the French writer the Comte de Mirabeau, though it has been placed in other mouths as well, held that Prussia was not a state that possessed an army, but an army that possessed a state. It was barely an exaggeration. A realm of only a few million people, poor in soil and thin in revenue, sustained a standing army out of all proportion to its size, one that ranked among the largest on the continent, though its population ranked nowhere near so high, and nearly every organ of its government existed, in the last analysis, to recruit, to clothe, to feed, and to fill the ranks of that army. The core of the army was its infantry, and the core of the infantry was drill. Prussian foot soldiers were trained until the intricate sequence of loading a flintlock musket, biting the cartridge, priming the pan, ramming home powder and ball, collapsed into a single unthinking motion that could be repeated faster than any rival army on the continent could manage. The iron ramrod, which the Prussian service had adopted a generation before, and which did not splinter under the frantic pressure of battle as the old wooden rods so often did, let the Prussian line deliver its volleys with a mechanical rapidity that could break an opposing formation before it had crossed the killing ground. The men who worked this grim machinery were raised largely from the peasantry through the cantonal system, by which every regiment was allotted a district of the countryside, and every district bound to furnish and to replace its soldiers, so that the obligation of service was stitched permanently into rural life. Above them stood an officer corps drawn almost wholly from the Junker nobility, the landed squires of the Prussian East, for whom a commission was at once a mark of caste and an unquestioned duty owed to the crown. It was not, for all that, an army of willing patriots. A great part of its strength was made up of foreigners, mercenaries, prisoners, and men swept up by the recruiting parties abroad, and the native conscripts had been pressed into the ranks rather than drawn to them. Such an army was held together not by loyalty but by fear, and the fear was deliberate. Discipline rested on a brutal code of corporal punishment, the cane wielded freely by sergeants, and, for graver offences, the running of the gauntlet, in which a condemned man was made to walk again and again between two long files of his own comrades as they struck him. So real was the danger of desertion that the whole army was managed to prevent it. Encamped away from woods, marched in close and watchful order, its foraging supervised, and the ordinary soldier had good reason to dread his own officers as sharply as he dreaded the enemy. In all of this the army remained to the end his father's creation before it was his own. The soldier king had spent a reign and a fortune assembling it, drilling it, and hoarding the treasure to pay for it, and had governed his household by the very code he imposed upon his regiments. The son who had once flinched under that code now administered it and bettered it, and turned the instrument of his own boyhood terror outward upon the map of Europe. He kept the plain blue coat, the killing routine, the worship of discipline, and added to them a strategic imagination his father had never possessed. What the father had built to shield a vulnerable kingdom, the son would wield as a sword, and the machine that had been the shape of Frederick's own making became, in his hands, the shape he pressed upon everyone around him. Upon this inherited instrument, Frederick imposed a generalship distinctly his own. His signature maneuver, remembered as the oblique order, the Schief Schlachtordnung, was an attempt to escape the bloody stalemate of the era's set-piece battles, in which two long lines simply battered one another until one of them gave way. Instead of engaging along his whole front, Frederick would deliberately refuse one wing, holding it back and out of the action while he massed the weight of his infantry, cavalry, and artillery against a single flank of the enemy, striking one end of the opposing line with overwhelming local force before the rest of it could wheel about to help. Executed cleanly, it could crumple an army from one side and roll it up along its length. But it demanded a speed of march that few forces of the age could match, an exactness of timing, and an iron steadiness under fire, and it could miscarry disastrously when any one of these failed. Frederick asked such things of his soldiers because he asked them of himself as well. He commanded from the front, rode into the smoke to steady a faltering line, and paid for that exposure with horses shot dead beneath him and, on more than one occasion, a coat torn through by enemy bullets. Yet the genius, if that is the word for it, can never be prized apart from its cost, and the cost was counted in human beings. The wars Frederick fought, the two campaigns by which he seized and then secured Silesia, and above all the far grimmer world war that came after, devoured soldiers at a rate a kingdom as small as Prussia could not hope to replace. The totals are disputed and always will be, for the accounting of the 18th century was crude, its records broken, and the estimates of modern historians diverge by the tens of thousands. What is beyond dispute is that the dead across Frederick's wars ran into the hundreds of thousands, soldiers and civilians alike, and that entire Prussian regiments were destroyed and rebuilt more than once over, the gaps filled with foreign prisoners and half-grown boys. His mastery of the field was genuine, so was his readiness to spend life on a scale that drained his own country of its men and left villages across Prussia short of the young hands to work them. The brilliance and the butchery were not opposites. They were one thing seen from two sides, and still the reputation held, and it held longest among those best qualified to judge it, other soldiers. For 100 years after his death, his campaigns were taken apart and studied in the war academies of Europe. The very man who would one day break the Prussian state in a single afternoon at Jena, Napoleon Bonaparte, examined them closely, and, standing before Frederick's tomb at Potsdam, is said to have told his officers that had the old king still been living, they would not be standing there at all. But admiration for the craftsman should not disguise the purpose of the craft. This magnificent engine, the wonder of its century, and the model for armies not yet raised, had not been built to defend a homeland under threat. It had been built, and it was used to take and to keep what was not Prussia's, and its brilliance was always the brilliance of a weapon in the hand of a man who had himself been forged into one. The army was the thing his father had built and he had perfected, and it was the truest portrait of the man, precise, tireless, magnificent and terrible in the price it exacted. With it he had turned a second-rank kingdom into a great power, and with it, in the years to come, he would hold that kingdom together against half of Europe. But between the wars there were years of peace, and in those years Frederick raised another monument to himself, as unlike a parade ground as a flute is unlike a musket. On a vineyard terrace above Potsdam he built a small pleasure palace of a single story, filled it with music and French wit, and kept every woman and every care outside its doors, and gave it a French name that was also a confession. He called it Sanssouci, without care. The years of war and the seizure of Silesia had left the Prussian state bruised and drained, and yet they had also brought Frederick the one thing he most wanted, the security to build, at last, the world he had once been able to imagine only in secret. By 1745, with his frontiers quiet for a time, he turned to the low hills above Potsdam. There, on a south-facing slope that he ordered cut into 6 broad terraces and planted with vines and figs behind tall glazed niches, he raised the house that would become his private legend. He called it Sanssouci, and he never meant it for a seat of government or a stage for royal ceremony. It was to be a refuge, a long, low pavilion of a single story washed in yellow, its garden front opening through great glass doors straight onto the terraces, and ornamented within in the light and playful rococo manner that still bears his name. It was raised between 1745 and 1747 by the architect Georg Wenceslaus von Knobelsdorff, working to sketches the king had drawn with his own hand. Here, the heavy blue coat of the soldier could be laid aside for the ease of the study, and the crash of the parade ground gave way to the sound of the flute. It was a world deliberately sealed against intrusion, and above all against women. The Queen, Elizabeth Christine, whom he had married to satisfy his father and then quietly set aside, never once crossed its threshold. In her place the king gathered a small and shifting company of men, soldiers, poets, philosophers, and wits quick enough to keep pace with his rapid and cutting talk, around a round table that would live in memory as the most brilliant in Europe. A later artist, Adolf Menzel, would paint that circle in the following century as a scene of serene, candlelit communion, the king standing at his flute before a rapt company. But Menzel worked a full 100 years after the fact, and his glowing canvases are a romantic imagining of Sanssouci, not a record of it, and must never be taken for one. The daily reality was less golden and far more exacting. Frederick lived by the clock. He rose in the dark, often before 4 in the morning, and drove himself through the mountains of reports and petitions and dispatches by which a kingdom is governed, much of it transacted through written orders sent out from his cabinet rather than face to face, with the tireless, unsentimental diligence of a head clerk who happened to wear a crown. In the evenings he played, and sometimes performed music of his own composing, for the flute was the one companion of his boyhood his father had never quite managed to take from him. It was from that desk, far more than from the battlefield, that the other half of his reputation was made. Frederick was a genuine child of the Enlightenment, if a cold and pragmatic one, who held that a ruler's whole business was the welfare and the strength of his people, the two being, in his mind, very nearly the same thing. In an age still poisoned by sectarian hatred, he made religious toleration a settled principle of the Prussian state. Confronted early in his reign in 1740 with a question of religious conformity, he wrote across the margin of the paper the words that became his signature upon the matter. Jeder soll nach seiner Façon selig werden, that everyone must be allowed to seek his salvation in his own fashion, and he meant them as policy rather than sentiment. Catholic and Lutheran and Calvinist and Jew were within limits left to their own consciences, and refugees and immigrants of many faiths were drawn into his thinly peopled lands for the skills they brought. He moved as well against the cruelty of the old law, abolishing the use of judicial torture in nearly all cases at the very start of his reign, and through his great jurist Samuel von Katte he set in motion a vast and patient reform of Prussian justice, the codifying labour that would at length appear, some years after his own death, as the sweeping legal code of 1794. His mind turned always toward the practical. He drained marshland and settled new farmers on the reclaimed ground, winning fresh acres from the bog as other kings won them by war. And when he looked upon the recurring hunger of his sandy northern kingdom, he fixed upon the potato, the strange, distrusted root out of the Americas, as a hardier and more dependable crop than the grain that failed so often. He pressed it upon a suspicious peasantry with the same insistence he brought to the handling of a regiment, by decree and by relentless example. The fond tradition that he set soldiers to guard his potato fields for show, so that curious villagers would take the tubers for something precious and steal them away to plant, may be more folklore than history. But the policy beneath the story was real, and in time the potato became a staple that stood between the Prussian poor and famine. The claim to servanthood was not mere phrase-making. He toured his provinces in person, year after year, inspecting regiments and granaries and the accounts of his officials, riding the sandy roads of his kingdom to see with his own eyes how it was governed. He lived in the midst of a splendid court, with a striking personal meanness, the same few plain uniforms worn until they were shabby and snuff-stained, the same Spartan routine. And he drove his ministers as mercilessly as he drove himself. Whatever else might be laid against him, the charge of idleness could not. He worked, quite literally, until the day he died. He gathered up this whole idea of himself in a phrase that would outlast him by centuries. He was, he wrote, the first servant of the state. The words were genuinely his own. The thought recurs across his French political writings, from the private testament he composed for his heirs in 1752 to the essay on the forms of government he wrote in old age, in which he named the sovereign the first servant and first magistrate of his people. That he wrote it in French is itself a clue to the deep contradiction lodged in the man. For the ringing German version by which later Germany would remember him, Der erste Diener des Staates, was a rendering made by other hands. Frederick himself thought and joked and corresponded and wrote his verse in French, imported French taste and French company wholesale, and held the German language and its literature in open contempt, dismissing them as the coarse speech of barbarians, even as he ruled a German people. His enlightenment, real though it was, had strict edges and a single purpose. He served the state, he did not liberate it. He left untouched the serfdom that bound the peasant to the soil, and left intact the enormous privilege of the Junker nobility, whose sons officered his army. Because both were load-bearing pillars of the Prussian order, he existed to make stronger. He reformed the machine so that it would run better, not so that the people inside it might be free. And at the still centre of all this labour sat a strangely cold and solitary figure. He could be the most dazzling talker in Europe, and yet no real warmth seemed to reach him or to flow out of him. His wife lived apart, all but erased from the record of his days. The companions of his famous table were held at a measured distance and let go without much ceremony when they wearied or disappointed him. The creatures that seemed to command his plainest affection were his Italian greyhounds, which had the freedom of his rooms, and near which he would one day ask to be laid in the ground. He served his subjects with a genuine and grinding devotion, but it was the devotion of a master toward a well-kept estate rather than of a father toward his children, and the light he shed across his kingdom was a clear, cold light that warmed nothing, least of all the man who cast it. He called himself the first servant of the state, and in his own fashion he meant it. He rose before the sun, worked like a clerk over the ledgers of his kingdom, and gave his people a tolerance rare in that hard century and a justice better than most, and fed them at last with a strange new root from the Americas that they had at first refused to eat. And yet no warmth reached the man at the centre of it all. He served his subjects. He did not love them, and did not pretend to. There was one relationship left in which he still seemed to hope for something like affection between equals, his long romance by letter with the greatest writer of the age. In 1750 he at last persuaded Voltaire to leave France and come to live with him at Sanssouci. It would end in one of the most famous quarrels in the history of letters. The dream had been 14 years in the making, a long-distance courtship of the mind carried on in elegant French across 1,000 miles of paper. Frederick had still been a frightened crown prince, hiding his books and his flute from his father, when he first wrote in 1736 to the man who was already the most celebrated writer in Europe. It was Voltaire who had corrected and championed the prince's first book into print, and Voltaire, whose approval the young Frederick had courted with something close to worship. By 1750 the prince was a king 10 years on his throne, and the idol of his youth, now 56 years old, had at last been coaxed into leaving France to come and live beneath his roof at Potsdam. To the philosopher king it was the crowning ornament of a reign that prided itself on wedding power to intellect. He heaped upon his guest every token of favour a monarch had to bestow: a handsome pension, the gold key of a chamberlain, the star of the Order pour le Mérite, and the freedom of his libraries and his supper table. The most brilliant mind of the age had come to adorn the court of the most talked-of king in Europe, and for a season it seemed that reason itself had found a throne to sit upon. The heart of the enchantment was the king's evening table. Each night Frederick set aside the dry and exhausting labour of government to preside over a small company in which, by his own insistence, rank counted for nothing, and only wit was sovereign. The talk ran entirely in French, ranging over poetry and philosophy and the vanities of the age, honed by the king's own considerable powers as a talker and by the presence of the sharpest tongue in Christendom. Frederick took a keen delight in loosing Voltaire upon the duller minds of his court and watching them cut to ribbons. He set the poet to a more intimate labour too, handing him his own French verses to be polished and corrected, a service Voltaire performed with waning patience, privately weary of tidying the amateur poetry of a king who could not bear to be told his lines were weak. For a time the arrangement flattered them both, but two such men, each vain, each jealous of his own genius, each armed with a wit that spared nobody, could not be shut up together for long without striking sparks, and the daily friction of living side by side began to wear away what the distance of correspondence had so long preserved. The first real wound was dealt over money. Within months of settling at court, Voltaire entangled himself in a shabby financial speculation, going to law in 1751 against a Berlin jeweller and financier named Herschel over a sour dealing in Saxon banknotes, a squalid affair of disputed bills and mutual accusations of forgery that dragged the great philosophe through the courts and the gossip of the city. Frederick, who prized the outward discipline of his state above almost all things, watched his celebrated guest exposed as a grasping speculator and felt his once boundless admiration curdle into a cold contempt. He had summoned a god of letters to Potsdam and found he was sharing his house with a man of very earthly appetites. The final rupture came over a third man, Pierre Louis de Maupertuis, the French mathematician whom Frederick had installed as president of his Berlin Academy of Sciences, was a figure of stiff dignity and towering scientific vanity, and he made an irresistible mark for Voltaire's ridicule. That Maupertuis was the king's own appointee, lured to Berlin to lend the young academy its lustre, only made the coming insult the more intolerable to Frederick. When a bitter scholarly quarrel at the academy gave him his pretext, Voltaire did not merely take a side. In 1752 he loosed upon Maupertuis a savage and brilliant little satire, the Diatribe du Docteur Akakia, which held the president of the king's own academy up to the laughter of all Europe. Frederick, seeing the institution he had built and the authority he had lent it mocked in open print, flew into a fury and had the offending pamphlet burned in the streets of Berlin by the hand of the public executioner. It was an act of raw royal power turned against a few sheets of paper, and it severed something between the two men that could never afterward be made whole. By now, the salons were passing round a cruel little story about the king's designs upon his guest, that Frederick meant only to squeeze the orange for its juice and then throw away the rind, keeping the poet no longer than his genius was of use. The jibe was too neat, and too widely repeated to be trusted as anyone's true words. It was fathered variously on the king speaking of the poet, and on the poet speaking of himself, and it belongs to the folklore of the affair rather than to its record. But it fastened on to something many had come to suspect beneath Frederick's enlightened surface, a cold readiness to use a human being and then discard him. The story clung to his name long after the men who first told it were gone. Voltaire understood at last that the king's favour had hardened into a kind of captivity, and in 1753 he took his leave, but even the parting was dragged through the mud. That June, as the poet made his way homeward through the free city of Frankfurt, Frederick's agents fell upon him. The king, his pride raw, and his nerves alarmed that Voltaire might publish the volume of his own private and amateurish French verse that he had printed for a few friends, as the Œuvre du Philosophe de Sanssouci, had given orders that the poet be detained until the book was surrendered. And so, for the better part of a month, the most famous writer in Europe was held under guard in a Frankfurt inn, his papers ransacked, his money and effects impounded by royal officials, and even his niece, who had travelled to meet him, swept up in the same petty humiliation. It was a graceless, tawdry business, a collision between two giants that ended in the dusty back rooms of a provincial tavern, and it shamed the very enlightenment that both men claimed to serve. The whole affair had made a mockery of the very ideal it was meant to crown. Frederick had summoned Voltaire to Potsdam to prove that a king could also be a philosopher, that power and wit might sit at one table as equals. And the experiment had ended with the king's officers rifling a poet's baggage in a rented room over a book of bad verse. Europe, which had watched the two men praise one another for years, now watched them disgrace one another over money and wounded vanity, and drew its own conclusions about how much the friendship of princes was worth, and how thin the varnish of philosophy could prove when it was scraped. They never met again. And yet neither could quite finish the break. Within about a year the letters had resumed, and the two went on writing to one another, flattering and wounding by turns, until Voltaire's death in 1778. The poet's colder revenge was taken on paper and reserved for after his own lifetime. In his memoir, set down after the rupture by a wounded and vengeful man, and published only once he was safely dead, Voltaire drew a portrait of Frederick so mordant and so grotesque that it became the great poisoned well from which later ages would draw their picture of the king as a monster of cold vanity. It is a dazzling book and a merciless one, and it is among the least trustworthy of witnesses. It can never be read as neutral testimony, for it was composed for the express purpose of wounding the man whose likeness it claims to give. What it records with real accuracy is not Frederick, but the depth of the injury the two had done each other. The two men who had flattered one another for 14 years across 1,000 miles of paper could not endure 3 years under the same roof. They parted in spite and in pettiness, a king setting his agents on an aging poet in a Frankfurt inn over a book of verse, and they never saw each other again. And yet neither could quite let the other go. They wrote on, wounding and charming by turns, until death. It was the pattern of Frederick's whole life laid bare. He could admire, he could dazzle, he could correspond across a continent. But he could not live beside another person and love him. He was 41, master of a great power and the most brilliant court in Europe, and he was utterly alone. And far off, on 3 sides of his kingdom at once, his enemies had begun to gather. The peace that had followed the seizure of Silesia was never more than a long and uneasy breath held by a continent that waited for the fire to catch again. Frederick, passed those years drilling his army, fortifying his frontiers, and warming himself in the flattering light of his fame as the philosopher king of Sanssouci. But in the chanceries of Europe the map was being quietly redrawn against him. Maria Theresa, the Habsburg Empress, had never for one moment reconciled herself to the loss of her richest province, nor forgiven the man who had torn it from her in her first year on a contested throne. A woman of formidable will and deep Catholic conviction, she regarded Frederick not as an honourable rival, but as a godless upstart who had broken the settled order of Europe, and through the long years of nominal peace she bent her patience toward a single end: to take Silesia back, and to cut the overgrown power of Prussia down for good. Her instrument was Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, a diplomat of chilling patience and subtlety, who understood that the old quarrels of Europe counted for less than the one new danger of Prussia. In a stroke of statecraft that astonished every court from London to St. Petersburg, Kaunitz undid the most ancient enmity on the continent, the centuries of hatred between the House of Habsburg and the House of Bourbon, and drew Austria and France, the immemorial antagonists, into common alliance. It was the more shattering to Frederick because France had been his own partner in the last war. The ground he had counted on had simply reversed beneath his feet. This was the diplomatic revolution of 1756, and for Prussia it amounted to a sentence of near total isolation. Russia, whose Empress, Elizabeth, loathed Frederick with a fierce and personal passion, joined the closing ring. Sweden and a crowd of the lesser German states of the Holy Roman Empire fell in behind. Against the whole array, Frederick could set but a single friend, Great Britain, bound to him by the Convention of Westminster and absorbed in its own worldwide struggle with France, on the seas and in the colonies, able to send him subsidies but few soldiers. And Britain's concern was less for Prussia than for Hanover, the German electorate of its own royal house, which lay exposed to French attack, so that the friendship was one of hard interest, and its help would come chiefly in coin. On paper the odds were simply hopeless. The populations ranged against him outnumbered Prussia's several times over. The treasuries and the armies of Austria, France, and Russia together dwarfed anything that a kingdom of a few million souls could put into the field. Worse still was the shape of his own lands, for the Hohenzollern territories lay scattered and open across the North German plain, without mountains or broad rivers to shield them, so that an enemy might come at them from almost any side at once. And the purpose of the coalition was not the adjustment of a frontier, but the undoing of a state, to strip away Silesia, to shatter the Hohenzollern power, and to press Prussia back into the second rank from which Frederick's father and grandfather had so laboriously raised it. The soldier king's son stood at the opening of the reckoning, very nearly encircled. Frederick did not wait to be crushed. Reading the encirclement as a design already settled against him, he resolved to strike the first blow, and in August 1756 he flung his army, with no declaration of war, into neighbouring Saxony, a smaller German electorate that lay squarely across his road into Austrian Bohemia, and whose army and revenues he coveted for the struggle ahead. He called it a necessary act of preemption, a stroke of self-defence against enemies who had already resolved upon his ruin. His adversaries called it exactly what the author of the Anti-Machiavel had once denounced in print, another act of naked aggression by a king who wrote against conquest and practiced it whenever it paid. The argument over his motives is as old as the war itself, and both truths can be held in the same hand, that he was in real danger, and that he answered the danger by invading a neighbour who had not yet lifted a sword against him. He occupied Dresden, seized the Saxon state papers to comb them for proof of the conspiracy, and drove the Saxon army back into an entrenched camp at Pirna. When an Austrian army under Marshal Browne pushed north to relieve the trapped Saxons, Frederick marched to meet it and fought it at Lobositz in Bohemia on the 1st of October, 1756. A hard, confused action, bloody enough to force the Austrians to fall back. Later that month, the abandoned garrison at Pirna laid down its arms, and the whole Saxon army was pressed, regiment by regiment, into Prussian service. Frederick had won the opening round, but the fire he had kindled would not be confined to Germany. Already the rivalry of Britain and France was burning across North America and India, and now the continental war of Prussia against its neighbours fused with that overseas struggle into a single, vast conflict fought on 3 continents and 2 oceans, the war that history would come to call the 7 Years' War. The following spring, Frederick carried the war into the heart of the Habsburg lands, driving south into Bohemia in search of the one crushing victory that might force Maria Theresa to terms before her allies could bring their full weight against him. On the 6th of May, 1757, beneath the walls of Prague, he appeared to find it. The Austrians were beaten back into the city, but the cost was fearful. Thousands of his finest troops lay among the dead, and the victory decided nothing. The Austrian army was bloodied but unbroken, and it drew back behind the fortifications of Prague, which Frederick now settled down to besiege. To lift the siege, the Austrians sent their ablest commander, Marshal Leopold von Daun, north with a fresh army, and on the 18th of June, 1757, Frederick turned from Prague to meet him in the rolling country near Kolin. It proved the gravest miscalculation of his career so far. Daun had drawn up his larger force along a line of high ground in a formidable defensive position, and Frederick's attempt to turn its flank came apart in the execution. The assault degenerated instead into a succession of costly frontal attacks sent in against unshaken Austrian infantry and clouds of light troops across open, rising ground, and thrown back with terrible loss. By the close of the day, the Prussian army had been broken. Many thousands killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. The exact tally disputed to this day, but amounting by most accounts to something near a third or more of the men Frederick had led onto the field. It was his first great defeat, and its consequences followed at once. The siege of Prague had to be given up, and with it every hope of the swift decision he had gambled upon, and Frederick was thrown back out of Bohemia altogether, the entire southern offensive undone in the space of an afternoon. Now the full weight of the coalition began to descend upon him. Through the summer and autumn of 1757, the armies closed in from every direction at once. The French advancing out of the west into the German heartland, a Russian army grinding in from the east across the exposed province of East Prussia, burning as it came, and the Austrians, emboldened by their triumph at Kolin, pressing north and west to reclaim the Silesia he had held for 16 years. His veterans lay thick in the Bohemian ground, his treasury was running dry, and his one great friend across the sea sent money, but no men. To very nearly every observer in that darkening autumn, the Prussian cause already looked lost, and the coalition tightened its grip in the confidence that the reckoning long promised to the upstart King of Prussia had come at last. By the autumn of 1757, the arithmetic was simple and merciless. Austria, France, and Russia held between them many times his soldiers and his money, and their armies were closing on Prussia from 3 directions at once, while his single ally across the sea sent subsidies and little else. He had been beaten out of Bohemia, a French army stood in the west, a Russian army in the east, and the Austrians were pouring back into the Silesia he had stolen 16 years before. Every cold calculation said that Prussia was finished and its king with it. In the 5 weeks that followed, Frederick would fight 2 battles hundreds of miles apart that would be studied in war colleges for 2 centuries, and prove that whatever else he was one of the great soldiers of history. The autumn of 1757 had brought Prussia to the very threshold of extinction. A French army and its imperial allies were pushing in from the west. The Austrians had come flooding back into the heart of Silesia in the east, and Frederick stood between them, a king with scarcely a country left to defend, at the head of an army that seemed marked for nothing grander than a final and sacrificial stand. He was, by the cold arithmetic of that season, the most isolated man in Europe. His treasury was drained, his reserves of trained men hollowed out, and the shining reputation of the Philosopher Prince of Rheinsberg lay buried somewhere beneath the wreckage of a summer of retreats. And yet it was precisely here, in the smoke and confusion of two battles fought a month and hundreds of miles apart, and not in the quiet music rooms of Sanssouci, that the legend of the unbeatable commander was truly forged. The first came on the 5th of November, near the village of Rossbach. Frederick's army, a force of perhaps 22,000 men, stood facing a combined French and imperial host very nearly double its size. The Allied commanders, certain of the numbers on their side and eager to crush the Prussian upstart once and for all, moved with a slow and swaggering confidence and set their columns marching across the front of Frederick's position in a clumsy attempt to sweep around his flank and cut off his retreat. It was the blunder he had been waiting for. From a low rise the king watched their long files trail themselves out across the open ground, exposed and strung thin, and then he moved with a speed that seemed to belong to another age of war. His cavalry, thrown forward under General Seydlitz, fell upon the head of the marching columns before they could deploy into any line of battle. His infantry and guns came up hard behind, and the great Allied army, caught strung out on the road and never once permitted to form, did not so much lose the battle as dissolve out of existence. In something under 2 hours it was over. The invaders streamed away in a rout that littered the fields with the debris of a professional force, and the cost to Prussia was almost nothing, a few hundred men against many thousands. It was a masterpiece of manoeuvre, and its echo carried further than any victory of his career. For France, above all, it was a humiliation without measure. The first army of Europe scattered in an afternoon by the king it had marched out to destroy. And the sting of that afternoon would not soon be forgotten in Paris. Overnight, the man whom half of Europe had denounced as an outlaw and a tyrant was toasted in the salons of the Enlightenment as a hero, and in the scattered and quarrelling states of Germany, a new and tentative pride began to stir around the king who had humbled the armies of France. That this same hero was still, in the same breath, the aggressor who had opened the war, and that Rossbach was a dazzling stroke in the defence of a conquest, was a complication the toasts passed over. Both things were true at once, but there was no leisure at Rossbach in which to savour the glory. Away to the east, the jewel of his reign was being prized loose from his grip. Silesia, the rich and populous province he had seized as a young king 16 years before, was being overrun and dismantled by the Austrians while his back was turned. Without a pause, he wheeled his army around and drove it east. In a punishing forced march of some 200 miles in under a fortnight, he hauled his men across the width of a war-ravaged country in the closing cold of the year, and came at last to Parchwitz in late November to gather to himself the shaken and outnumbered remnant of his Silesian forces. There, by an account long repeated and impossible now, to verify word for word, he called his officers together and spoke to them with a stripped and desperate plainness that he meant to attack the Austrian army wherever he found it and against whatever odds, that he would beat it or perish in the attempt, and that he would forgive a man many things, but never despair. Whether the words fell exactly as the survivors remembered them, or were burnished afterward by hindsight, The resolve behind them was real, and it was total. On the 5th of December, on the flat frozen fields near Leuthen, he staked everything upon it. The Austrian army before him, commanded by Prince Charles of Lorraine and the cautious Marshal Daun, held a strong position and badly outnumbered his own. But Frederick knew this ground intimately, and he had devised an attack that depended utterly on the precision of the finest drilled infantry in Europe. He opened with a feint against the Austrian right, a show of force loud and convincing enough to draw the enemy's attention and his reserves across to that wing. Then, screened by a low chain of hills, he marched the bulk of his army unseen across the Austrian front and massed it against the opposite flank. When the blow finally landed, it fell where the enemy was weakest and least prepared, and in the full oblique order, the whole weight of his army brought to bear on a single point of the line, while the rest hung back and refused. He rolled the Austrian position up upon itself like a carpet. By the time the winter dark came down, the larger army had been broken to pieces. The fortress city of Breslau surrendered soon after, and Silesia was once more his. Leuthen would be studied in the war academies of Europe for 2 centuries. Napoleon himself, who would one day redraw the continent, is said to have called it a masterpiece of movement and resolve. But such judgments, weighed in the pure currency of genius, passed lightly over what the day had actually cost. For the truth of Leuthen was written not on the strategic map, but in the casualty returns. The tactical victory was as complete as any in the age, and it was still a wound that a country as small as Prussia could not go on sustaining. Men who had survived the parade ground's discipline and the killing pace of the march were dying now by the thousand, and there were no fresh thousands waiting in the thin, sandy villages of the north to take their place. Every one of these beautiful and terrible victories was at once a triumph of the intellect and a consumption of the very substance of the nation. Brilliance on a battlefield could not conjure new battalions out of the air. It could not fill the empty pews in the village churches, or give back the lost generation of farmers and craftsmen who had marched away in Prussian blue and would not come home. Each such battle spent in the space of an afternoon, veterans it had taken years of relentless drill to make, and no royal edict and no fresh levy could raise their like again in time to matter. And Frederick, who counted his veterans as closely as his father had once counted coin, read that ledger more clearly than any of the courts now drinking his health. He held the 2 truths in a single mind, the exhilaration of the flawless win and the crushing weight of a strategic trap that no victory seemed able to spring. He had proven twice inside a single month that he was the first soldier of his age, and he was still caught in a war of attrition against powers that could lose a whole army and treat it as an inconvenience, to be repaired by the next levy raised out of the vast and inexhaustible East. His enemies were checked, humiliated, stunned. They were not destroyed. Already they were stirring again, gathering fresh forces to replace the ones he had shattered. He had played his hand with a brilliance that would be admired for centuries, only to find the house itself still slowly collapsing around him. In 30 days he had annihilated a French army in the west and an Austrian army in the east, and made himself the most admired soldier in Europe. Men who had written him off as finished now spoke his name with awe. But no genius on a battlefield could manufacture soldiers, and every victory cost him veterans a poor kingdom could not replace, while his enemies drew on populations many times his own and simply raised fresh armies out of the inexhaustible East. He had won everything a general could win, and still he was losing the war. One irreplaceable regiment at a time. 2 summers later, on a sandy rise east of the Oder, that arithmetic would very nearly kill him, and by nightfall he would be setting down, in his own hand, the words of a man preparing to die. The war had ceased to be a struggle for territory or a contest of maneuver, and had become instead a pure contest of endurance. And Prussia was slowly bleeding to death. Frederick could still win battles. What he could no longer do was win the war, for every victory cost him men he had no means of replacing, and left his enemies as numerous as before. By the late summer of 1758, the map of his world had narrowed to the perimeter of his own camp. On the 25th of August, at Zorndorf, his lines met the Russian army in a slaughter so savage and so nearly purposeless that it broke the nerve of hardened veterans on both sides. A swirling chaos of smoke and steel that left thousands of men dead in the rye for no result that could honestly be called a victory. He had forced the engagement and driven his soldiers into the teeth of an enemy that simply would not run. He held the field at the end of the day, and it had the character less of a triumph than of a mutual ruin. Zorndorf would be remembered as one of the most murderous days in a century that had seen a great many, and for all its dead, it had decided nothing whatever. The strain of such days had begun to show upon the king himself. He was no longer the restless, dashing strategist of the early campaigns, but a man visibly aging under the weight of command, gaunt and sleepless, turning harder and more solitary with each passing season. And then, in the same grey autumn, the war reached past the battlefield and into the one small, locked room of his private affections. On the 14th of October, 1758, the very day the Austrians fell upon his camp in a night surprise at Hochkirch, overran his tents, and killed some of his best officers where they stood. His sister, Wilhelmina, died far off at Bayreuth. She had been the companion of his childhood, and very nearly the only person he had loved without reserve, the one soul who had shared both his tastes and his terrors in his father's house. The king who had schooled himself to absorb the loss of provinces and armies without a flicker had no such defence prepared against this. He could not easily speak of her afterward, he could only go on. The year 1759 opened under the promise of total collapse, his enemies drawing in around him like a tightening cord. By August, the pressure had gathered to a single point at Kunersdorf, a village near Frankfurt an der Oder, where a combined Russian and Austrian army had dug itself into strong ground along a line of sandy heights. Every instinct of caution warned that a frontal assault on such a position was folly, and his own generals urged him to be content with the advantage he had already won that morning. He would not. The early hours of the battle went well, and the taste of a half-won victory drew him on to press the attack up the slopes against all advice. And there, on the 12th of August, the day turned into catastrophe. His infantry, worn down by weeks of marching and short rations, climbed into a storm of case shot and musketry and were cut down in rows, their formations coming apart before they could close with the enemy works. Wave after wave went up the loose, sandy slope and melted into the fire. The broken ground itself tangled the famous Prussian order until the regiments that had been the envy of Europe dissolved into knots of exhausted men with nowhere left to go. Frederick rode into the worst of it. 2 horses were shot under him in the confusion, his coat was scorched, and a ball that should by every reckoning have killed him was turned aside by a metal snuff-box in his pocket, a detail his admirers would later fold into the legend as a token of providence, though to the men dying around him there was no sign of providence anywhere on that hill. By several accounts, he seemed that day to be seeking his own death and could not find it. By nightfall his army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Some 19,000 of his men were dead, wounded, or missing. His guns were taken and his regiments scattered, and out of the host that had marched to the heights that morning he could gather only a few thousand around him in the dark. That night, in the wreck of his command, he wrote what remain the most haunting documents of his life. In a series of letters to Berlin, he set down that all was lost, handed his authority to a subordinate, and wrote of the end of the state and the end of his own hope in language stripped of its habitual wit. The exact wording has been disputed and much handled in the centuries since, but the letters have been read ever after as a farewell not merely to the campaign, but to life itself. The words of a man who could see nothing left to defend, and who did not expect or seem to wish to live to watch his kingdom carved apart. And then the blow that should have finished him did not fall. The victorious Russians and Austrians, each of them badly mauled in the fighting, and each deeply distrustful of the other, failed to march the short distance to a defenceless Berlin. They halted, they quarrelled over the spoils, and they let the moment of their absolute triumph slip through their fingers. It was, in Frederick's own later phrase, the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, a deliverance he could not account for by any strategy of his own, granted by the hesitation of his enemies rather than the strength of his arm. He did not squander the gift. With a strange and unnatural energy, he set about building an army out of the wreckage, recalling the walking wounded, scouring the countryside for recruits, remaking the machine of war from scrap. But the recruits were younger and rawer with every passing year, and the veterans fewer, and the army he led out in 1760 was a paler copy of the one that had won at Leuthen, a thing he understood better than anyone. It was a reprieve and not a rescue, and the ruin ground on. Through 1760 and 1761, the war became a bleak round of movement and counter-movement that drew the very marrow from the state. At Liegnitz in the August and at Torgau in the November of 1760, he won victories hailed as masterpieces of manoeuvre, and they carried him no nearer to peace. They were costly, hollow things that thinned his officer corps and emptied his treasury and settled nothing. Torgau alone, won in the dark of a November evening, was bought at so terrible a price in men that the victory was scarcely to be told apart from a defeat. In October of 1760, he suffered the sharpest humiliation of all when a joint Russian and Austrian force raided and briefly occupied Berlin itself, plundering the capital before it withdrew. The king was reduced to a hunted man moving about his own lands with a small mobile court, and, by a report much repeated and impossible now to confirm, carrying a dose of poison against the day the trap should finally close upon him. By the winter of 1761, the case had passed beyond repair. The British subsidies that had kept the Prussian state solvent were being cut off as the political wind shifted in London. His soldiers were worn thin, his generals were aging, and the ring of his enemies had nowhere given way. He was an old man now in everything but the tally of his years, his body worn with the aches of one far older, his spirit long since hammered into a shell of duty. He had outlived his sister, the destruction of his army, and the sacking of his capital, and there was no manoeuvre left anywhere on the board that could stave off the final exhaustion. On the night after Kunersdorf, with his army in fragments around him and 2 horses dead under him that day, Frederick wrote to Berlin that all was lost, gave away his command, and set down words that read like a farewell to his own life. He was 47, he had gambled his kingdom and, so far as he could see, lost it, and he did not expect to live to see another spring. That he survived at all was an accident of his enemies' exhaustion and distrust, and not of his own strength. For 2 more years the ruin ground on, Berlin plundered, the treasury empty, the great army worn down to a memory, until by the close of 1761 there was nothing left to hope for but the one thing that no strategy could summon. And then in a palace in St. Petersburg, an aging empress who hated him closed her eyes for the last time, By the turn of the year 1762, the survival of Prussia had narrowed to a single fraying thread, and Frederick, who had already reconciled himself to the end, could do nothing but watch to see whether the thread would hold. He had built his whole life upon the clarity of his own reason, and reason told him plainly that he was finished. The state his father had left him, frugal, ordered, solvent, was a hollowed-out shell. The treasury was empty. The young manhood of the nation had been poured into mass graves from the Baltic to the Bohemian frontier, and the ring of his enemies was closing with a patient, mechanical certainty. He had opened the war 6 years before as a bold aggressor who believed he could outrun his own shadow. 3 great powers had been grinding at him ever since, and only 2 summers earlier, on the heights at Kunersdorf, he had come within a single night of the end. He was ending it now as a hunted man who lived under canvas on campaign, waiting for the collapse he could no longer see any way to prevent. Then on the 5th of January 1762, the ground shifted beneath the whole war. In the gilded isolation of the Winter Palace at St. Petersburg, the Empress Elizabeth of Russia breathed her last. She had been the most implacable of all his foes, a ruler who, by the report of those about her, had sworn to sell the very last dress in her wardrobe rather than give up the war until Frederick was utterly undone. Her hatred of him had been personal, absolute, and tireless. She had been the keystone of the coalition that had brought him to his knees. Her armies had wintered on his soil, burned his provinces, broken his finest regiments, and stood for a season in his capital. For 6 years her will had been the driving wheel of the war against him. Her death was no mere change of ministry. It was the removal of the single greatest weight pressing down upon his kingdom's grave. The throne passed to her nephew Peter III, a man who carried not a particle of the dead Empress's cold resolve. Peter was, in every respect that touched Frederick, a worshipper. He had grown up dazzled by the Prussian king's reputation, collecting his portraits, aping his manners and his uniforms, revering him from afar as the very summit of soldierly and enlightened kingship. His accession was not a shift of policy to be haggled over through envoys. It was an instantaneous reversal of the entire engine of the war. Almost from the hour he took the crown, Peter moved to break with the coalition that had all but strangled Prussia. First came an armistice that stilled the guns along the Russian front. Then, in the May of 1762, the Treaty of St. Petersburg was signed, and the impossible became fact. Russia, which had bled Prussia white for years, not only quit the war, but handed back every inch of the territory it had conquered, the whole of occupied East Prussia among it, the province about Königsberg that its armies had held since early in the war, and even placed a corps of Russian troops under Frederick's own command. Frederick himself, writing to his ministers, gave the deliverance the name it has borne ever since, the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. He knew better than any man alive that it was no miracle of divine favor, but a miracle of pure, blind, and chaotic fortune. He had been beaten. He had been outmaneuvered by every rule of strategy. He had been doomed. And then the Russian weight that had been grinding his state into the dust was simply lifted away, as though the gravity of Europe had shifted in the course of a single night. The rescue was as total as it was undeserved, and nothing in the manoeuvres that had won him, Rossbach and Leuthen, had bought a foot of it. It was the sharpest of ironies in a life crowded with them that the most coldly rational commander of his age, who trusted nothing he could not weigh and calculate, should owe his throne and his life in the end not to any calculation of his own, but to the failing health of an empress in a palace 1,000 miles away. Even when the tide within Russia turned again, when Peter III was deposed and killed within months in a coup led by his own wife, the woman the world would come to know as Küstrin the Great, the course of the war did not swing back. Küstrin had priorities of her own, and the tethering of Russian armies to a ruinous coalition she had never valued was not among them. The reprieve held. With the Russian shadow gone, the enemies who remained, worn out by the sheer scale of the killing and grown wary of one another, found their appetite for the struggle guttering out. Frederick turned what strength he had left against the Austrians, and discovered, in the sudden slackening of the war, the room to maneuver that had been denied him for years. He marched and fought and held his ground, but the fire had gone out of the thing. Maria Theresa, who had spent the better part of 20 years and a fortune in blood and treasure to win back the province he had torn from her, found at the last that she could not do it alone, and was brought to sit down and confirm him in the very possession she had gone to war to overturn. On the 15th of February 1763, the Treaty of Hubertusburg brought the 7 years' war at last to a close, and its terms were as stark as they were bitter, the status quo ante, the world set back exactly as it had stood before. Prussia kept Silesia, the province for which the whole continent had been set alight, and not a single frontier in Europe was moved by so much as a mile. Hundreds of thousands of men were dead, villages had been wiped from the map, and treasuries had been drained to the edge of ruin. All of it, in the end, to restore the map of 1756 precisely as it had been before the first shot was fired. Frederick came home to a landscape of desolation. The Prussia of his father's careful penny-counting order was gone, and in its place lay a country of widows and orphans and untilled fields, its people thinned by war and hunger and disease, its herds driven off, its towns half ruined, its very spirit consumed by the endless appetite of his campaigns. He had been a young man of 28, flute in hand and Voltaire at his elbow, when he first crossed into Silesia. He came back from this last war grey and stooped, the survivor of a catastrophe he had done as much as any man alive to bring about, and the war had settled on the map precisely, nothing that had not stood there before the first shot. He had gained the thing he set out to gain. He had held his borders, and he had confirmed Prussia as a great power that no court in Vienna or Paris or London could any longer afford to overlook. But the gain was the crown's, and the price had been his people's, and the two were never to be reckoned in the same ledger. He was not the man who had ridden out to seize Silesia 22 years before. He had learned that his genius upon the battlefield was no shield against the caprice of fortune, and that the deliverance which saved him at the last had been none of his own doing. What lay before him now was not conquest, but silence, the quiet of a ruined country that would have to be raised again, acre by acre, out of the wreckage he had helped to make. A single death in a distant palace had saved him where no victory could. The empress who hated him was gone, her successor worshipped him, and the vast Russian weight that had been grinding Prussia into the earth simply lifted. Within the year the war was over, and Frederick had kept every acre he began with, and lost a generation of his subjects to hold it. He came home the acknowledged master of a great power, and a prematurely old man, grey and stooped at 51, who had watched his country burned and his friends buried, and had once written out his own death in his own hand. There would be no more wars of conquest left in him. What remained was more than 20 years of peace, and a slow hardening into the strange, solitary figure his people would come to call, with a mixture of awe and dread, and something not far from love, simply Old Fritz. The peace that settled over Prussia in the winter of 1763 was not the quiet of a country at rest, but the exhausted stillness of a man waking in a hospital bed. The 7 Years' War had been a hemorrhage. Hundreds of thousands of his subjects were dead of the fighting and the hunger and the sickness that came in the army's wake. Whole provinces had been stripped and depopulated, villages burned to their foundations, the livestock slaughtered or driven off, and the fields left to run wild with weeds. Frederick had survived it, and he possessed the singular cold-eyed capacity to treat a broken kingdom precisely as he would have treated a broken regiment. He returned to his capital, not as a conqueror riding in triumph, but as the first clerk of his own state, descending into the ledgers of his ruined provinces with a ferocity that bordered on the obsessive. He called the work the rétablissement, the re-establishment. And he threw the resources of the crown into it as wholly as he had ever thrown them into a campaign. He remitted taxes for years to the hardest-hit provinces and reached into his own war chest to hand out seed grain, farming tools, and many thousands of army horses to a peasantry that had nothing left to plough with. He drained the great marshes of the Oder and the Warther, turning fever-ridden swamp into arable land, and settled it with colonists drawn from across Europe, so that new villages rose in the emptied country where there had been only reeds and standing water. He rebuilt the town halls and the churches, laboured to steady the shattered currency, and pressed upon his people, with that stubborn, hectoring, schoolmasterly insistence that was the very grain of him, the cultivation of the potato. He had become convinced that this strange root from the Americas was the one crop that could carry a dense population through famine, and he bent every instrument of the state to force it into the Prussian soil, issuing decree after decree and, as the tradition has it, planting the fields of his own estates to teach a doubtful peasantry by example. He was the first servant of the state now in the most literal and grinding sense. He rose before the sun, his work-table buried under reports, and he held every official in his kingdom to account for every bushel of grain and every head of cattle. In these last decades, the dashing prince and the ambitious young conqueror hardened into the figure that would pass into legend as der Alte Fritz, Old Fritz. He became a fixture of the Prussian scene, a bent old man in a shabby blue coat dusted grey with spilled snuff, his back permanently stooped, the hooked nose and the pale, piercing eyes set in a face scored deep with lines and lit by a sharp and comfortless intelligence. He seldom strayed far from Potsdam. He had all but withdrawn from the society of men, retreating into the cool silence of Sanssouci, where his days ran in a fixed round of work and reading, of the flute, and of long, solitary walks upon the vineyard terraces. He was mordantly, woundingly witty, he was famously misanthropic, and he had a way of looking at a man that seemed to strip the pretence off him where he stood. He was feared. And yet, strangely, a dark and durable affection began to grow up around him among the common people, for the old king who lived for nothing but the state, who had no wife at his side, no child, and no life at all beyond the borders of his duty. Such family as he had was a pack of Italian greyhounds. He kept them about him in his chambers, let them run on the gilded floors and leave their muddy prints across the parquet, and spoke to them with a gentleness he never once showed a minister or a general. His wife, Elizabeth Christine, lived on in her own separate household, a queen in little more than name, whom he saw only on the stiffest and most formal occasions of state. By most accounts he ignored her with an unwavering, chilling consistency. One anecdote, much repeated and perhaps too neat to be wholly trusted, holds that when he met her again after the long years of the war, he greeted the wife he had not seen in an age with nothing warmer than a remark upon how stout she had grown. They had no children, and he seemed to wish for none. He had been formed long before by one impossible attachment and one annihilating loss, and he had settled it with himself decades since that the risk of loving a human being was one he would never run again. And yet this was the very same man who, in 1772, set his hand to the first partition of Poland. It was a stroke of cold and cynical statecraft, the mature work of the prince who had once published a book denouncing the greed of conquerors. Acting in concert with the empires of Russia and Austria, Frederick carved a slice from a defenseless neighbor and annexed Royal Prussia, West Prussia, the very stretch of territory that at last bridged the gap between his heartland of Brandenburg and the distant duchy in the east from which his house took its royal title. It was done without the firing of a single shot. It stitched the scattered pieces of the Hohenzollern lands into one connected body and satisfied an ambition a century old. When word reached him that Maria Theresa of Austria had wept as she signed her name to the partition, even while she pocketed her share of the spoils, he is said to have delivered one of the most memorable of all his barbs. She wept, but she took. It was an assessment entirely in his own key, a flat recognition that in the traffic of power a ruler's professed scruples were merely one more weapon in the armory. The twilight of his life brought one last small war, the War of the Bavarian, succession of 1778 and 1779, a nearly bloodless and dispiriting affair of marches and countermarches, in which the soldiers spent more of their strength foraging for food than in any fighting, and which they christened in mockery the Potato War. It had the feel of an echo of a life already lived out, a final dry exercise for a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone on earth. He went on as the tireless keeper of his own legend, corresponding with the philosophers of the age, composing French verse that was polished and correct and somehow cold at its centre, reviewing his troops and watching the balance of Europe from his terrace with a steady, unillusioned eye. He was in his 70s now, the last survivor of the generation of monarchs who had made a chessboard of the map of Europe. His health began to break in the summer of 1786. He was 74, worn down by asthma and dropsy, and a deep, mounting exhaustion that even his iron will could no longer master, and he sat wrapped in his coats in his armchair, labouring for every breath, still calling for his reports, and still signing his orders. He knew that the end was near, and he had made his peace, not in his creedless way, with any god, but with the shape of his own history. He had settled long before where he wished to lie, on the terrace of Sanssouci, in the earth where he had planted his vines, beside the graves of the greyhounds who had been his truest company. It was to be the last quiet and defiant choice of a man who had spent his whole existence in the public gaze, and who asked at the end only for the society of the few creatures he had ever allowed to come near him. He died, as he had lived, in an armchair at Sanssouci, in the small hours of an August morning, an old man in a threadbare coat with his dogs beside him, and scarcely a human being left alive whom he had loved. He had asked for one thing only at the end, to be buried without ceremony on the vineyard terrace of his little palace, among the greyhounds who had been better company to him than any person ever was. His own heir refused him even that, and carried the body off to lie in a garrison church beside the father who had once made him watch his friend die, the abused son and the brutal father together beneath a single stone at last. It would take 200 years and the fall of a wall to bring Frederick home to his dogs. But long before that, other men would come for his body in another sense entirely, to dig up the legend and put it to work for purposes he had never dreamed of. The legend of Frederick the Great was not merely something that happened to him after his death. It was a structure he had helped to build, brick by brick, from the moment he took the throne. He understood the power of an image better than almost any ruler of his age, and he shaped the persona of the philosopher king with the same care he brought to the ordering of a battalion. He was, in a real sense, the author of his own myth, the man who published the Anti-Machiavel, that ringing argument against the wickedness of conquerors in the very season he was preparing to fall upon Silesia. The man who sustained the picture of the serene flute player of Sanssouci through decades in which he plunged the continent into wars that killed hundreds of thousands. It was a double performance, and in the generations after his death it hardened into two separate icons. The lone warrior king who stood unbroken against a world in arms, and the gentle sage who wished for nothing but his music and his books. Both are masks, and both have served to keep the real man in shadow for more than 200 years. Many of the myths were the work of later ages, rather than his own. They are scattered through the popular histories of the 19th and 20th centuries, repeated with a confidence the sources cannot bear. There is the stirring, apocryphal cry attributed to the field of Colline, where he is supposed to have roared at his wavering soldiers, "You rascals, would you live forever?" A line that catches the spirit of the legend and appears in no reliable contemporary account. There is the world-weary epigram quoted everywhere, that a crown is merely a hat that lets the rain in, a phrase that fills the modern quotation books and traces back to no document from the king's own pen or from the notebooks of anyone who knew him. These are the inventions of a later hunger to explain him, to make him wittier or wiser or more cynical than the record allows, and the Frederick they conjure is a character in a play his descendants wrote. The sanitized sage who plays his flute while the aggression is edited out of the frame is one such invention. The pure warrior hero who has never read a book of philosophy or reformed a law is another. Neither mask is the man. The making and remaking of the legend did not stop with his own century. As German nationalism gathered force in the long wake of the Napoleonic Wars, Frederick was increasingly enlisted as a founding hero of a militarized German state. The king who had willed a great power into being out of a small and unpromising one. In the 20th century, the National Socialist regime took up his memory in the same spirit and pressed it hard into its own service. Adolf Hitler is documented to have prized the king's image and to have kept a portrait of Frederick by him in his Berlin bunker in the final weeks of the war. Those are the bare facts, and they belong to the history of his reputation rather than to the history of his life. That each later age reached back and found in him precisely what it needed to find tells us a great deal about those ages and little that is new about the man who had died in 1786. To see past the accretions, one has to return to the man himself and to the contradictions that were the truth of him. He was a genuine reformer, and the reforms were not poses. He swept judicial torture almost entirely out of his courts at the very start of his reign, threw his lands open to the refugees of a less tolerant Europe, drove the humble potato into the ground to hold off famine, remade the law under his jurists, and called himself, and in his fashion meant it, the first servant of the state. And the same hand that lightened the law and welcomed the persecuted was the hand that opened the 7 Years' War, a conflict of naked aggression that left his own kingdom bled white. The same pen that had denounced the robber prince in print seized Silesia in his first year as king, and carved a slice from a defenceless Poland in his old age. He was the wittiest man at the wittiest table in Europe, able to charm the sharpest minds of the age across a supper or 1,000 miles of correspondence, and he could not, in the end, simply live beside another human being as an equal and love him. He drifted from the wife he never wanted, held his companions always at the length of an outstretched arm, and gave the one unguarded tenderness of his life to the greyhounds at his feet. All of it was true at once, and the film that flatters him into a hero or shrinks him into a monster loses him entirely. He was, in the last reckoning, a man who never wholly recovered from the terror of his boyhood. The anvil of his father, Frederick William I, had struck the soft iron of the child so hard and so often that the shape it took was permanent. And the memory that set at the centre of him, the wound that never closed, was of Hermann von Katte crossing a fortress courtyard at Küstrin in the November of 1730, while the 18-year-old prince was held at a barred window and made to watch. So far as anyone could ever afterward tell, something in him closed for good in that hour. The lesson, learned in a single stroke, that to love another person openly was to hand a hostage to fate. Every friendship he permitted himself thereafter, every flirtation with the philosophy of the Enlightenment, every cold calculation of the interest of the state can be read as a defense raised against ever standing so exposed again. He did not become what he became in spite of his father's cruelty. He became it because of that cruelty. He turned the terror of the soldier king's house into the machine of the Prussian state, and he turned the loss of his one friend into the permanent solitude of his own heart. When Napoleon Bonaparte stood before the tomb of Frederick at Potsdam in 1806, having just shattered the Prussian army the old king had built, he is reported to have told his marshals that if Frederick was still living, they would not be standing where they stood. It was a soldier's tribute to a soldier, an acknowledgment of the genius that had haunted the century, but it was also in its way a misreading. Frederick had not been a man of inexhaustible strength. He had been a man of inexhaustible artifice, who had held a kingdom together by the sheer, strung tension of his own nerves, and when at last the flute was laid down and the shabby coat was taken off for the final time, what remained underneath was only the boy who had been made in the shadow of a tyrant. He had played the part assigned to him so completely and for so long that the world took the costume for the soul. The journey of his own remains ran nearly as long and as troubled as the journey of his name. For the better part of 2 centuries he lay where his heir had put him, in the garrison church at Potsdam, beside the father he had never wished to lie beside. In the upheaval of the Second World War, his coffin was carried off for safekeeping and hidden away underground, and afterward it was kept for decades more far from Potsdam in an ancestral seat of his own house in the West, separated from the one place on earth he had loved above all others. He remained a displaced king, held from his chosen ground, until the map of Germany was redrawn once more, and the wall that had split his old capital came down. 2 centuries after they refused him, they brought him home. On a summer night in 1991, in a Germany made whole again, the coffin of Frederick the Great was carried up the vineyard terrace of Sanssouci and lowered into the earth beside the greyhounds he had asked to lie among, without a hymn and without a salute, exactly as he had wanted and exactly as he had once been denied. On the plain slab there is no crown and no sword and no roll of victories, only his name, and, left there by strangers who come to stand a moment above the most formidable and most solitary king of his age, a scattering of potatoes. He had been the warrior every general studied and the philosopher every wit admired, and neither was the truth of him. The truth was a gifted, frightened boy at a barred window in 1730, watching the one person he loved walk to the block, learning in a single stroke never to love again. And the cold, brilliant, lonely man that boy was made into, the king who conquered a province and wrote against conquest, who served a people he could not love, and who asked, at the last, only to be laid among his dogs. His father had set out to break him. In the end, that is the one thing the soldier king truly achieved.